Life is good, it's time to take a spin in the C5, and so you back it out of the garage. Now most people simply just proceed on and drive away, but not you, because you are a diligent Corvette owner, and anytime you take your C5 for a spin, you make it a habit to perform the easiest multi-system diagnostic check known to man, and that is to take a peek at the ground that was under where your C5 was parked to make sure there aren't any fluids there that weren't there before. And unfortunately, this time, as luck would have it, you spot a small puddle, so now what?
Toys for life.
Recently, I was underneath my C5 working on the exhaust tip upgrade video when I discovered that my C5 sprung a leak between where the transmission and the differential meet, and that gave me the idea for this video because our cars are now 20 years old, and whether we like it or not, they're going to spring leaks from time to time. And so in this video, we're going to cover every possible place a C5 Corvette can leak. Let's start off by talking about exactly what you should do in order of importance right after finding out your C5 has sprung a leak. These first steps will allow you to make an informed decision as to whether or not you can keep driving your C5 for a while monitoring your fluid levels, or if it's a leak that needs immediate attention. The first thing you need to do is to figure out what type of fluid is leaking, and this is because some fluid leaks are much more critical than others. For instance, if you have a small, relatively minor oil leak coming from a valve cover, it's typically not an emergency and it's something you can fix when you find time. Now, by contrast, if you have a small fuel leak, this is critical, and if you don't fix it immediately, it's possible your C5 could burn to the ground. Second, we need to figure out how bad is the leak, because no matter what type of fluid you have, if it's a serious leak that's just dripping all over the place, obviously you have to park your C5. By contrast, if you've got a small oil leak coming out of the front timing cover seal, you can just monitor that while continuing to drive and fix it when it's more convenient. Third, how far away are you going to be driving your C5 over the next weeks and months? Because if it's only 20 miles away from home, you could easily monitor something like a small transmission fluid leak while waiting to get it repaired. Now, if you're going to be heading out to the Corvette Museum for a trip and that's 1,000 miles away, probably not a good idea. And last, how difficult is it to fix your oil leak? For instance, if you've got a small but annoying leak coming from your rear engine oil main seal, you probably want to hold off a little bit and just monitor that closely rather than have the whole car torn apart just to fix it. And that hits pretty close to home for me because I lived with a small rear main leak in my C5 for a couple of years, and finally when I went to put a new clutch in it, you're doing 90% of the work to get to the rear main seal anyway, and so I did the rear main at the same time that I was doing the clutch. And of course, if you've got a simple leak coming from your valve cover, just fix it next Saturday. Now let's just walk through and briefly discuss every single C5 leak I can possibly think of in alphabetical order. Air conditioning system water leak. This is totally normal. We've all seen it. It's clear water. It can be quite a bit of water on the floor. Happens in the summer months, and it's usually kind of in the center of the car, off to the right a little bit, almost where the passenger's feet would be if you kind of drilled a hole and went right down to the ground. 100% normal, nothing to worry about. Air conditioning system oil leak. Now you may not know it, but your air conditioning system does contain oil, somewhere around 9 ounces, but you rarely will ever see it on the ground underneath your C5. It typically will just seep out past the seal on your air conditioning compressor or your various tube connection points within your air conditioning system. You've usually got a joint with an O-ring, and if it's leaking, a little bit of oil gets out over time, it collects dirt, and then it looks grimy after a little bit, and usually you won't even know anything's wrong with your air conditioning system until it stops working. Automatic transmission fluid leak. You probably know this already, but your transmission is in the rear of the C5, and if you've got a leak, it's usually from the front seal, the rear seal, or the transmission pan gasket, and there's a set of cooler lines that go all the way to the front of the C5 because the cooler, the stock cooler anyway, is inside the radiator. So those are the main points that it can possibly leak. Now your automatic transmission has around 11 quarts of fluid, so if you do have a small leak, You can nurse it along for a little while until you get the repair taken care of, but it makes sense to get under the right of way to determine where the leak is coming from. If it ends up being the front or rear seal on the transmission, that's a big job. You've got to remove the transmission. And at that point, if you've got a lot of miles on it, you're probably looking at a total rebuild. If you're lucky, it's coming from the pan gasket, which is an easy fix, and you can just do that when you're changing the filter anyway. If it's coming from one of the lines going up to the radiator, that's not so bad, but you're going to want to get that fixed right away as well. You want to keep a good eye on it, especially with the engine running, to get an idea of how bad the leak is, because if you run your transmission out of fluid, that's pretty expensive. Battery leak. If you have any reason to believe your C5's battery is leaking, you want to check it out immediately. Even if you're using a sealed lead acid battery, they really are anything but sealed, and they do leak from time to time. The problem is the C5's computer is directly under the battery, and if you get a leak onto the computer and the main wiring harness that goes into that, that's an expensive repair. Furthermore, your frame rail is down there. You want to catch this right away. If you have a leak, make sure you clean it with a baking soda solution to neutralize the acid. And do yourself a favor, get an absorbed glass mat battery for your C5, or AGM for short. These don't leak. You don't have to worry about all that damage underneath. And this topic is so important, I actually did an entire video on it. There will be a link in the upper right hand corner and in the description below. Blinker fluid. This is the unicorn of C5 fluids, and I can promise you 3 things on Toys for Life C5. Death, taxes, and your C5 will never ever have a blinker fluid leak, because there's no such thing. Brake fluid, it's typically clean and clear when it's new. It gets kind of dark if it hasn't been changed in several years. In our C5s, since they're not driven in the winter, we don't have to worry about our steel lines rusting out. So if you have a leak in your brake system, it's probably one of the soft hoses that allow the suspension to move. You've got 2 in the front, 1 in each corner. It could be a caliper seal that's gone bad. So if you have any reason to believe that your brakes might be leaking, maybe your pedal's going down farther than normal, or you check your reservoir and it's low, you want to make sure you get underneath, check that out immediately, because driving with leaking brakes is extremely dangerous. Clutch fluid leak. Now your clutch fluid is essentially the same thing as brake fluid, so the colors are the same. If you suspect a leak, it usually is coming from the slave cylinder, which is kind of at the back of the engine towards the middle of the car. You'd see some fluid on the ground. And the clutch fluid reservoir is so small, check it, because if it's at all low, you've confirmed your leak. Now you can drive with a leaky clutch slave cylinder, but since that reservoir is so small, if it runs out, your clutch isn't going to work and you're going to need an Uber. Coolant leak. Now most C5s that are running around are using GM's Dex Cool, which is orange in color, or it could be green in color if somewhere along the line in your car's history somebody changed it over to the green style of coolant, which is fairly common. Now the cooling system holds a little over 12 quarts, so if you have a really small leak, you can continue to drive for a little while. In my experience for C5s, and really a lot of cars in general, if you've got a really small coolant leak, chances are it's coming from the water pump, where the pulley shaft goes into the water pump. There's a little weep hole for this exact purpose. If that seal starts to fail, coolant will start dribbling out of that weep hole. As for the fast leaks, the most common cause is probably a ruptured radiator hose. That'll drain a lot of coolant in a hurry. Or if you have a cracked radiator, that'll leak a lot of coolant as well. Or if it's overheated, it'll spew out from the cap on the expansion tank, kind of making a mess and steaming all over the place. Worst case scenario, if you've got low coolant levels and you don't have any coolant on the ground anywhere, check your oil very carefully, and if it resembles a chocolate milkshake at all...
Oh wow.
Chocolate milk.
Chocolate milk for oil.
Then coolant is finding its way into your oil, and it's likely a bad head gasket. In this situation, you want to stop driving your C5 immediately because your oil is severely compromised. However, occasionally in cold weather with a lot of short trips, you'll see a little chocolate milk shape on the bottom side of your oil cap. In this situation, check your dipstick and go by the dipstick, because this is completely normal. Another telltale sign of a head gasket leak would be white smoke coming from your C5's exhaust, other than the first few minutes of startup on a cool day. So if you've got white smoke and you're not quite sure and your coolant level's low, get it diagnosed before you go any further. Anytime I suspect a leak in my C5 or really any of our family's vehicles, I pull out my relatively low-cost Stant cooling system pressure checker and test it with that. With the 5 cars we have in my family, I find myself using it every couple years, so it's money well spent. Differential leaks. Most C5s that I see have at least a tiny leak coming from one or both of the rear axle seals or the differential cover, which many people believe, including me, has a minor casting defect. Now, most differential leaks are extremely small because there's little if any pressure pushing the fluid out, and the 75 to 90 weight gear lube is by far the thickest fluid the C5 has, so by definition it would be the hardest to leak through the little nooks and crannies. If you do find some evidence that you've got a small leak to your differential, go ahead and top it off, and then over the course of a few weeks to a month, check it often so you've got a good idea of how bad the leak is, and then depending on what you find, you can schedule the repair. And know that it's not uncommon that some minor differential leaks just need to be topped off once or twice a year. Engine oil leaks. This is by far the most common leak that C5s have, and probably the most annoying because we're proud of our C5 Corvettes, and if you go visit a friend and when you go to leave, your Corvette leaves a little present in their driveway, it's kind of embarrassing. As some of you probably already know, some of the more common leaks come from things like the oil pressure sending unit, the cam position sensor O-ring, the rear engine main seal, the front seal, or the oil pan gasket seal, or even those pesky valve cover seals. Now go ahead and run your engine for about 5 minutes so you can get a good idea of just how bad that leak is. If it's not too bad, then just top it off. And then later, when you've got some dirty clothes on and some time on your hands, get out the mirrors and the light and maybe even put it up on jack stands, clean everything up and get a good look at where that oil's coming from. Then you can make an informed decision on if it's something you can repair yourself or you got to take it to your Corvette guy for. Exhaust leaking, and we're talking about it leaking clear water. This is completely normal, especially in cooler weather or where you make a lot of short trips. You get condensation in your exhaust system and it leaks all over underneath your mufflers. In fact, each of your mufflers has a little weep hole in it for the purpose of draining the water out of your exhaust system. Now, keep in mind, as we talked about in the cooling section, if your coolant expansion tank reservoir is low and you're not seeing any evidence of coolant leak underneath your radiator or the front of the engine, be very suspicious of your exhaust. If you're seeing any more white smoke than normal, get a good smell of it because coolant definitely has a distinct sweet smell to it. And until you can diagnose exactly where your coolant is going, I wouldn't drive it much. Fuel system leaks. Now, your C5 has actually got a pretty complex fuel system. It consists of 2 fuel tanks, one in front of each rear tire. There's a main crossover tube. There's fuel hoses and lines that go up to the front. Some years have an inline fuel filter. You've got a flexible connection to the engine, and you've got the fuel rail. Now, for the most part, the fuel system is pretty reliable, but the C5 is now 20 years old, so like all things mechanical, if you expose them to that many years of heat and vibration and exposure to fuel, things can and will fail. So guys, if you've got any evidence whatsoever of a fuel system leak, maybe you can see it or you can smell it, shut it off immediately because a fuel system leak should never, ever be ignored. Manual transmission leak. Now this is pretty much exactly the same as the automatic transmission, except with the manual transmission there are no cooling lines going up to the radiator. So if you've got a leak, it's typically going to be the front or the rear seals to the manual transmission, both of which unfortunately require removing the transmission. Oddly enough, the C5 manual transmission still use the red automatic transmission fluid, so at least that makes it easy to identify when comparing it against a potential leak from the rear diff, which will be kind of a brown-yellow thicker fluid. Unfortunately, this is becoming a more common problem with our 20-year-old cars, but the good news is that typically this leak is small enough that if you monitor it closely and continue to top it off once in a while, you can delay this repair until you have to do something bigger like a clutch replacement. Last but not least, power steering fluid leak. Power steering fluid is an often neglected fluid. I mean, when's the last time you checked your power steering fluid level? And through the years, various C5 owners use different types and brands of power steering fluid. Some people even use automatic transmission fluid, so the leak can be red or brown or several other colors. Power steering fluid is noticeably thinner and usually lighter in color than engine oil, and it's less watery than coolant, so it should be pretty easy to tell it apart. So if you have a fluid leak under the front end of your C5, go ahead and check your power steering fluid level first. It's got a very small reservoir, so that makes it very easy to tell if it's low. Many power steering fluid leaks on the C5 come from one or both of the bellows on the power steering rack, so if yours is leaking, go ahead and try Prestone power steering fluid plus stop leak. It's worth a try. If it doesn't stop the leak and yours is leaking all over, it's time to have the rack rebuilt. Oh, and by the way, I'm typically not a fan of any of the stop leak type products in a can, but with power steering fluid, I think it is worth a try. Guys, thanks for making it this far. If you learned something, hit that thumbs up below so YouTube knows to share this video. If you learned a lot, go ahead and hit that super thanks below. But most importantly, guys, thanks for watching.